Starting now. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon if you're joining us from the East. My name is Gabriel Olivella. I'm the coordinator of programs and events at the BC Council for International Education, and I would like to welcome all of you to the second session of this very interesting three-part series called Dialogues on Decolonization of International Education. Now, before moving on, I first want to acknowledge the territory from which I speak to you today, the unceded, ancestral, and overlapping territories of the Coast Salish peoples of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. For those of you not familiar with the BC Council for International Education, or BCCIE, we're a provincial agency under the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training, advancing the interests of international education throughout the entire education sector in British Columbia, spanning the K-12, higher education, and the language sector. Now, just a few housekeeping items before we continue. Microphones are muted now to help keep background noise at minimum and will remain muted during the presentations until we transition to the group activities and breakouts. If you would like to submit a question to our speakers during the broadcast, please type them in the chat function and we will get to those at the end of the presentations. If you require any technical assistance today, please pop your questions in the chat box and we will do our best to help you. And on that note, I'd like to thank my colleague Luke, who is helping me with any technical support during this series and in today's session as well. If you experience any video or audio lagging or skipping during this session, you have the option of dialing in by phone. While maintaining the computer access to video, just let us know if you have any questions about this and we will get to your inquiry. And now I recommend that everyone turn on your cameras at this time, if you feel comfortable, of course, so that we can all engage as a community. And now, some of you, if you attended last week for the first session, you are already familiar with the general context of this series, but I'd also like to take just 1 minute to explain why this series. So this three-part series is planned as an opportunity for dialogue, learning, and reflection on indigenization and also on the timely topic of decolonization as they relate to international education. We seek to offer concepts, frameworks, new perspectives, and discussions to support you in your learning process and practice. The three sessions are structured to follow a discussion format of past, present, and future. This means that last week's speakers from the first session, Dr. Jeffrey Schiffer and Elder Larry Grant, walked us through some key concepts, historical frameworks, and stories that explain and provide context to why we have a conversation about indigenization and internationalization in the first place. Today, during our second session, we will dedicate this time to examining the present. And in 2 weeks' time, on March 24, during our third and last session, we will set our vision to the future and discuss considerations for ethical engagements of internationalization with indigenization. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing facilitator for the series, Jessie Sutherland. Jessie does many things. She works as an international speaker, trainer, consultant, and is the director and founder of Intercultural Strategies. Jessie holds an MA in dispute resolution and has worked with organizations and communities to engage diversity and foster intercultural collaboration to address a range of complex social problems. So with that, before passing it over to Jessie, I do have a poll. I do have a question for all of you joining us today, and that is if you did your homework. So just very briefly, I'm going to launch a poll. Let's see. Oh, I'm not the host, so I'm gonna ask my colleague Luke if he has access to the poll and ask him if he can launch the poll. We can try that again, Luke. I think it launched for a second and it disappeared, so we can relaunch it again. There we go. Thanks, Luke. So the question is, did you fill out the building relationships worksheet? So this is a worksheet that we sent out in the thank you email, and we encouraged everyone to sit with the questions that were part of the worksheet. And also we invited all of you to take some time to fill out those questions as well with reflections. So let's just take a few more seconds to see what folks are answering. Okay, I think we can stop the poll at that time and see what the response is. Oh no! Okay, folks, so the response is 90% did not get to take a look at the building relationships worksheet, and 10% of you did. So congratulations to that 10%. The 90%, I hope that this session encourages you and confirms why it's important to do the extra work. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Jessie. Thank you, Jessie.
Great. Thank you so much, Gabriel, and for the whole BC CIE team for putting on this critical series, and for Sharon for contributing her expertise today, and for all of you for coming again for part 2. And last session, we talked about the past. So in all good practices around decolonization and indigenization, we always start with the past. And we had our session was called From Past to Present History, the understanding the history of international education prior to European settlement. And we were so fortunate to be blessed with Elder Larry Grant from Musqueam, who walked us through what the protocols were from a Musqueam experience and perspective for internation relations and internation education. And just a little refresher, a couple of the pieces that he talked about was the reciprocity. So if I was to come on Musqueam land, I would announce why I was there and enter into a relationship of reciprocity. So it could be that if I was to stay for a while, I might give the community salmon, or it might be something else, but that we recognize that we are all interconnected. And as I receive, I also give back. And that spirit of reciprocity is built into this series with the main call to action is to honor the speakers by not only listening, but then taking the practices and applying them to your work. So we are giving a 2-week break after this session so that those that didn't get to the reciprocity part of these series, which is doing the homework, can catch up, because we know that weeks can get, time can get busy and it's hard to get to, but it's really key that we practice reciprocity in honoring what the speakers are gifting us with their knowledge, and then bringing them back to our institutions and seeing how we can apply what they've shared with us. So Larry shared some of the protocols, and like I said, reciprocity was one of them. Another piece was the outstanding issue of land encroachment worldwide, and that needing to be rectified, and the connection to land. There was much more that he talked to, so I encourage you to listen to that recording if you weren't here in session 1. And then Dr. Jeff Schiffer brought us up to speed with some of the key concepts. So he gave his definition of decolonization and indigenization. He went through the relevance of the Truth and Reconciliation call to action around, and how its application to international education is pertinent. And he also touched on the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights of Indigenous People. And he ended, for those that were there, with a worldview exercise. So the understanding is that when we look at the past, one of the key pieces of our relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people has been this imposition of one worldview over another. And if we don't understand that, then as we're trying to decolonize and indigenize, we might actually keep on imposing a certain worldview in the process. And so the key piece of learning worldview skills, and he went through a mini worldview exercise with a stone. And so these are the key foundations that we've started on to get this series going. And now we're moving into the present. So today's topic is examining the present, interpreting and embracing the anticipated tension and opportunity of indigenization and internationalization. And I'm so thrilled that we have Sharon Hobenschild here to take us on this journey. It's been a delight to meet with her and work on this in preparing for her presentation, work with her in preparing for her presentation. And we are in for a treat. So a little bit about Sharon. Her traditional name is Aioli, and she belongs to the Wilp Mali from Gitxsan First Nations on her mother's side and is of German ancestry on her father's side. She currently works at Vancouver Island University, in fact, since 2006. And currently she's the Director of Indigenous Education and Engagement. And I can tell you we are in for a treat. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to Sharon for being here today and contributing these really deep insights that I think will anchor us perfectly for dealing with the present.
Great. Thank you, Jessie, for that kind introduction. Just want to also, in terms of my protocol, let you know that I'm coming to you all from the traditional territory of the Sinawas people in my little home here on Vancouver Island. And really pleased to be here. And I just want to thank the organizers for the invitation to be here, and all of you for coming in and entering the conversations. I know that these conversations can be quite daunting. And then when I looked at my title of this presentation, I thought, wow, that's not really helping to make things less daunting, but hopefully it all makes sense as we go through. And as I said to the organizers, I'm certainly, not an expert in international education. I'm not an expert in Indigenous education. I am always learning and humbled every day by what I don't know. And so I come to you with the spirit and intention of as a learner, and having conversations with you as learners, and also contributing the gifts, as Jessie said, that we do have to move us forward in those good ways. So again, thank you for being here. And the process for my process anyway, that I'll walk you through is that I'll do the presentation on goodness theory, which was a finding out of my doctoral research. I'm going to start with my own definition of indigenization, well, not mine, but David Newhouse's, because it helps to kind of ground me in the work that I do. And I'll share a little bit more about myself and where my kind of positionality and how I come into the conversation with my own lived experience. And we'll move through the goodness theory. And then towards the end, we will have a conversation using a tool to kind of ensure that we continually disrupt our ideologies as we go forward. So indigenization, this is from David Newhouse, and David Newhouse is an Indigenous scholar from Six Nations, and I heard him speak at student symposium some years ago, and I really appreciated at the time, and still do, this definition. And he speaks to that process where again, institutions begin to adjust to our knowledge systems and our structures and our truth tests. And I think this is so critical. And he also speaks to there being three phases of indigenization. The first one where we brought ourselves, and this is all in context of the Academy of Post-Secondary. And I think that first stage where we bring ourselves is really important, because to recognize that first stage happened in the 1950s. So before, I think it was 1951, when Indigenous people were allowed to get a university degree. So again, Indigenous scholarship is relatively new then, given that background. The second stage he talks about is where we brought our cultures. And then this third stage, which he identifies that we're in now, is where we bring our knowledges. And so he goes on to talk about, Gabriel, this site, the exploration first of our own ideas, and then for all of humanity. And I think that is so important to note, that I think that indigenization is all of our work, but it really needs to be led by Indigenous people and give it that authenticity. But again, where we are now, as I believe you talked about in your first session, is that Indigenous people have something to offer the world. And I think that people are, as do all knowledge systems, and I think people are beginning to recognize that. So, and then the last part there, which speaks a bit to my title, is, again, that these conversations there's opportunity, but there's complexity, and that dynamic is is alive. And I think that it's really important to note, and that's what I always try to do is when I'm creating this space is to ensure that we acknowledge and recognize that tension and opportunity that's embedded in these discussions so that we can, you know, again, name it as a place to honor and go forward. Okay, so these pictures, some of these, I noticed that some of my colleagues from BIU are on the call, and I'm sure that I know they've seen these pictures before. And so these are my grandparents, and that one picture with the baby, that's me. And I always joke that the little boy with the big ears is my brother. And so my grandparents were actually, they were actually my great grandparents, but they raised my mom, and so she considered them her parents. So my grandparents were, they spoke very little English. They weren't, you know, they grew up in their community, born and died in their own community. Their generation of children were the ones impacted by residential school and Indian day schools. And so as a result, they raised many of their grandchildren. And so, you know, including my mom. And the picture there is again, a very, very young me, leading my grandfather. My grandfather was blind. I only knew him as blind. He lost his sight midway through his life. And he was so well respected by my whole family. And I remember going to visit them, and whether I'd been there 2 days before or 5 days in a row or 2 weeks before, it was always the same routine where I'd walk in and he'd feel my shoulders and he'd feel my head and he'd feel my face, and then he'd pray over me. And then it would be the same thing when I left. It would be the same routine. And my granny, she was less emotive. Like I don't really remember ever receiving a hug from my granny, but she would always gift me as we left, and not just me, but all her grandchildren. She used to sit at the kitchen table and she'd pull out from under the table like candies or oranges, or sometimes she'd reach into her bosom and she had this little change purse and she would give us quarters, or sometimes it'd be a rolled up dollar bill. And so those experiences as a kid really grounded me in, you know, a sense of belonging and nurturing and acceptance, and especially through that gifting and this reciprocation that we're going to continue to talk about. Yeah, and my grandpa's words there, sorry, Gabrielle, to be good is to do good, is he used to say that. And again, he didn't speak very, very little English, but he learned those words and he'd say them to my brother and I, who didn't know the language. And so I knew as a little girl that they were important. I didn't know the significance of those words, but I knew they were important. And then as I become a young adult, I found that those words would come back to me, and in times of uncertainty, they would ground me. And I would hear as a mantra in my mind, and they give me, you know, some peace. And then as I moved away from home and started experiencing other Indigenous peoples and communities, cultures, I would hear similar things around to do the work in a good way, or to doing good work. And so it started to resonate that this was, again, this real principled place of heart connection, to be able to, that idea of being and doing and knowing, all connected to a place of the heart and spirit. And so as I move into goodness theory, I want to share with you that the collaborators of the goodness theory. And so again, goodness theory came to me in my, was a finding of my doctoral research, and the collaborators were, it's very important. You always, as Jessie alluded to, acknowledge where your teachings come from. And so I wanted to go home and talk to people in my own community, and the Gitxsan chiefs are the people that I really informed my work. And then I also wanted to honor the BIU elders who, for the last 5 years, had been continuing to teach me, and wanted to bring their teachings into my doctoral work. So that led me to this goodness theory. And so goodness theory is again, it's an Indigenous framework that centers this notion of a good heart, a good mind, a good spirit. And it's about balancing those things. And it aligns with other Indigenous philosophy, where creating that harmonious mutual existence among all things really is the essence of our being and our purpose in life. And this balance is we achieve through different principles and values. And these particular values and principles have been informed by the collaborators, as I indicated in the previous slide. And I'm just going to walk you through those principles. But I also want to say that, you know, I see the goodness theory as a starting place for this conversation, a place for others, all of you on the call, to explore your relationship with Indigenous peoples. And from your own particular social location. So as I go through these principles, I invite you to think of where the points of connection are from your own lived experiences and your traditions and your place of work and profession. And, you know, and when we speak from this place of value and principle, especially in decolonizing dialogues, you know, I believe we're speaking of how and why we do the work, not the what. Because the what is the tasky things that we get caught up in. And I'm inviting you to, again, think from that heart-placed work to enter this conversation. And I think, did I cover and I just, sorry, I gotta look at my notes here. Again, the areas of connection as we walk through, those are the opportunities for further connection and to foster relationships. And the areas of tension, you know, are just maybe an area for deeper understanding or just recognition that there's a distinction. And I think, as Jesse indicated in the beginning, you know, it's not about valuing certain ideologies over the other. And it's not about us all coming together as oneness and creating, you know, one heart, one mind in its totality. It's about recognizing, again, those distinctions and those points of connection so that we don't impose our value system on another, because we know that is the root of colonization. So with that, we'll go through some of these principles, starting with teaching. And so teaching is the value, and then the principle of respect and responsibility. And as Indigenous people, our teachings come from our ancestors. And so our parents and grandparents, their role is to provide those teachings. And, you know, my mother shared stories about my grandparents lining them all up at breakfast in the morning, and they would give them the teachings before anything. And as they were eating their breakfast, they would receive these teachings. And, you know, one of our teachings too is that as elders often share the teachings over food. So technically, I'm not an elder, but you should all be eating right now. And if you are eating, that's good, because the idea is as you're ingesting the food, you're consuming the knowledge. And so that is part of one of our teachings. And so a lot of these teachings come over feasting, or they come through storytelling, experiential learning, observation. But consistence among these teachings are this core value of respect. And you see it here in this quote by Fidelia, is that, you know, the teachings teach you to respect yourself first, and the idea that you then to extend that respect out to your community. And so again, it really became connected to this strong work ethic around enacting those responsibilities of respect on a daily basis with your community through helping. And so that's what this principle speaks to. And so the next value and associated principles is that of sharing. And this, I always say that Indigenous people are the most generous people that I know. Well, particularly Gitxsan people, but that's my own bias. And often, you know, that sharing is seen through the process of gift giving. And so some of you may have experienced the gift giving protocol that is inherent among Indigenous people. You know, my granny, as I said, she was the first one to teach me about the reciprocation of giving and receiving through those gifts that she would give me every time I went to visit. And, you know, as my granny got older, she got dementia. And so there became a time when those oranges she pulled out from under the table were rotten. But I knew by then not to refuse those gifts, because by refusing, I would be refusing her extension of love to me. I always get a little emotional there, but I'll get through it. And so that's, you know, so it is less about the gift, and it's more about, again, that giving and receiving. And I remember my mom, you know, as being a teenager, she would then carry that on, and we'd have people come to visit, and my mom would be like chasing after them, you know, driving out of the driveway, giving them food and gifts. And I remember being embarrassed as a teenager about that, not understanding as I do now, just again, that extension of reciprocity for someone who took the time to come and you welcomed into your house. The idea is that you honor that moment to not only nurture that relationship, but to sustain it going forward. And again, that's that mutual balance and extension among all our relations. And so that practice of gift giving that some of you may have witnessed within ceremonies of Indigenous people happens on a daily basis, and it's a manifestation it manifests in our public ceremonies, and it's so important to again recognizing our kinship ties, our ties to Mother Earth, and again, as Jessie alluded to in some of the reciprocity from her and giving of salmon. The neighbors just on the weekend, they brought us some crab, live crab, and so, we didn't have to gift them in that moment, but we know that we will gift them with something for that gift of crab. And the other thing is that we did is before we, killed the crab, basically, we said a prayer over those crab and thanked them for the sacrifice to give us sustenance. And again, so some of those giving and receiving comes through expressions of gratitude and back to Mother Earth and back to nature. So. And again, this quote that Geraldine speaks to here, again, speaks to not just the current relationships you have, but the extension of carrying those on into future. And so in some instances, you may not even know the people that you want to give, but your family knew, and you had teachings from your family about that family. So to show up and support them in their time of need. So the next value is around land and the principles of identity and relationship. Land, this is the greatest gift for Indigenous people. It's provides us with our very existence. As it says here, it's a gift from the Creator, and it's ours. We don't consider that we own the land, but it's our responsibility to get our sustenance, as I said, from the land, and to take care of it for future generations. And land is a place that it gives us our language, it gives us our food, it gives us our stories, and our very survival originates from the land. And as a result, it also then gives us our identity. So our stories and our songs are tied to the land. And so that's when we learn that connection about ourselves, then, we become stronger in who we are and our purpose in life. And this intimate relationship that we have with the land really is fostered through a sense of stewardship. I know when I was talking to one of my cousins there in the Chiefs for this, he was telling me stories of my grandpa, and my grandpa before he lost his sight, but even after he lost his sight, he was described as an excellent fisherman and a hunter because of his attention to the nature and the rhythm of the land. And Tony said he knew the tides, he knew the movements of the salmon, he knew the seasons, and he knew where to be at different times of the year. And the 4 seasons always meant something to him. So again, as Indigenous people, we follow that cyclical pattern of the environment, and it's less about the linear momentum forward. And and I remember my grandfather, again, just as he prayed over me, we'd be picking berries, or and he would be praying and thanking the berries and the environment for that. And first thing in the morning, same thing, he would thank the planet Earth. And so again, it's that expressions of gratitude that really foster that connection and relationship to the land. And the next slide there is around this way of knowing and the value of knowing and the principles of witnessing, acceptance, and healing. For me, what I've learned in being Gitsan, it's not enough to say that I know something, and I never pretend that I never say I know something. It's because my responsibility is to demonstrate how I know something. And so for me, that is going home and contributing to our feasts. And so in my community, our feasts are everything. It's our social system, it's our economic system, it's our governance. And when we have those feasts, so if my family, the Wilt Mali, were to host a feast, we take care of the food, we take care of the gifts, and we seat everyone. And then that extended family is the Wilt Mali. And then from that, we belong to clan systems. And my clan system is the Lakkabu, which is the wolf. And the other neighboring communities of the Gitxsan people that have Lakkabu tribes, and they too come. And while they may not be the host of that feast, they show up and help, and they bring food, and they help us serve. And then at the end of that feast, the last thing, and as a little girl, these feasts would go on forever. They start at 5 and someday they go till 2 in the morning. I always knew when it was over because the head chiefs of all the other house groups would stand, and one by one they would share if you lived up to the traditional values, the traditional teachings of your Eok, and those are our traditional laws. And so then that's again that there's reciprocation in that, but there's also a witnessing of your way of knowing coming from your community. And so my cousin Glenn says that's for him, he's the head of our WILP, that's the most proudest moment is for him is when those chiefs stand up and say that we've upheld the laws in a good way, in that good way. And so I think that again, that witnessing of that is really important. And the acceptance and healing, some of, again, one of the elders at VIU, Uncle Gary, he shared with me something similar in terms of, and he's very public and of course has permission to share that he went to residential school, and coming out of residential school was in active addiction. And he said there was teachings that his family was trying to pass on to him, particularly around this particular ceremony that he would lead with a rattle. And his family kept asking him to take that on, and he just didn't think he was worthy enough. And he said he kept getting signs from the spiritual world, but also, through birds and through different entities that about his, pushing him to take on accepting this rattle ceremony to lead it. And he said, when he finally did, that's when his healing really started. And so I think that, again, for Indigenous people, part of this conversation is to recognize that we're all in different stages of that, and through the results of colonization, that because I think sometimes we tend to romanticize these Indigenous teachings, and still some are still so impacted by colonization, it's hard to accept that, again, that traditional way of knowing and being. And so just important to recognize that in the people that we work with and people that we come to know. So that's goodness theory. And to reiterate, my invitation to you here is to consider this specific Indigenous perspective, not to be concerned with seeking the truth, which we often, speak to in academia, or to come together as oneness of thought, but to just open a conversation for you to consider these principles and these values and these associated principles, and as an invitation to then consider how that might apply to your practice. And so with that, I think I'm ahead of schedule, and which gives us more time for dialogue, but I think I'm passing it now on to Gabrielle, who is going to take us to the breakout activities.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for your presentation and for sharing your stories as well. Okay, so now we have a breakout activity. We have a group, really a discussion activity that we'd like to move on to now.